Hi, this is Reverend Dave Johnson, and you're watching Sequentially Yours.
Hey there, welcome to Sequentially Yours, initially mine. This is the show where we look at this week's number ones and tell you which ones you should pick up and which ones you probably shouldn't touch without hand sanitizer nearby. It's been a little while since I've done any of these. It's hard to buy a lot of comics sometimes, but I'm back into it. I've started getting the digitals because my house is getting to be a mess, and I've donated almost all of the bad comics that I didn't like to either Linkara or the ones that I liked but don't feel like holding on to various veterans charities so that they get to go out with care packages and whatnot to people who are, waging war for the United States, and so that they have some little bit of entertainment. It's not much, but it's something to do. Anyway, let's get right into it, because this is an interesting week, let me say that. Alright. Since I don't have the physical copies anymore, I'm just going to put all the stuff right over here. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so our first book for this week, speaking of people fighting wars, 24 Legacy, Rules of Engagement. First of all, let me say that has got to be the most 24 name I could think of. Rules of Engagement. It's... And yeah, this is about as 24 as it gets. Everybody is sort of a broad brushstroke. I'm not saying this is a bad comic per se, but I think that it probably has pretensions to being a lot more deep than it thinks it is, because it's consistently trying to draw parallels between action in Iraq and gang violence in Washington, D.C., because the main character has been involved in both, and it basically is showing these two different stories that are happening concurrent. They're happening years apart, but they're presented juxtaposed to one another in order to show the similarities. It's a little on the nose, and I gotta be honest, if you don't like 24, you're probably not gonna like this. If you do like 24, it's not necessary reading, but, you'll probably... Well, 24 Legacy specifically. But you'll probably enjoy it. I mean, it's not bad. It could be a lot worse, but instead we got a reasonably exciting, if nothing else, first issue here. It does a good job of explaining who all the characters are. Granted, it does it in a kind of simple way at the beginning, but it does it. So I'm not lost as I'm reading this. As somebody who has never watched an episode of 24... but knows people who have and who have told me about it, and I'm trying to give a basic idea of what I know of the show. This will probably be up your alley if you like 24 Legacy. Not really much else to say. The art is okay, if a little bit splotchy, and the writing is, again, pretty basic. There's only so much you can do with 24 Legacy. It runs into a problem that a lot of licensed properties run into, which is that they need to draw people in who are not necessarily familiar with the property that's being licensed, but they also need to not bore the people who know what's going on, and that is a tough line to walk. This walks it reasonably well. I'm not sure if you could hear it, but if you hear, jingling noises outside, that's an ice cream truck going by my house. I love living in a neighborhood with an ice cream truck, but yeah, I get to hear the jingle as it drives by and occasionally stops in front of the house to sell stuff to kids, so I apologize for that, but I wanted to get this recorded. Anyway, moving on. Next, what do we got here? Jungle Fantasies Survivors. It's porn. I mean, this is not even... I was reading, I'm like, I guess this is softcore. Nope, hardcore porn. Straight out... penetration on panel, penis everywhere, vagina everywhere else. I mean, it's just porn. Apparently the Jungle Fantasy series is one that has been out for a while. I have never read it before. It's been published previously in black and white. This is colorized, and jumps off from several of the stories that are apparently established in previous jungle fantasy books. I don't want to talk too much about the story because there isn't much of one. It's basically 3 stories that are 2 to 3 pages apiece. That have just been, put in there. So you see 2 or 3 pages of a story, and then it moves on to another one. Apparently, we're supposed to know these characters. It gives you very little in the way of backup for this. And yes, I'm going to review this as if it is supposed to be a number 1 and not masturbation material, because that's what we do on this show. It is the way it is. So yeah, the characters are not very well developed, nor do I understand who they are in advance. I mean, I'm told who they are. I'm told who some of them are, but not a whole lot. I know Zeke is a jerk, that he's been pretending to not be from the future, but he actually is. Excuse me. There's another person from the future who just found out, and it was a big revelation, which I think the use of the word lovelies to refer to the various cave people that are fighting dinosaurs probably would have been a good giveaway. But, yeah, now, keep in mind, this is a fairly long book. Despite it only being 2 to 3 pages per story, they then tell all of the stories over again, but this time with the girls full nude rather than wearing fur bikinis. So we get the same story twice, just one is supposed to be more titillating than the other. It's not very good porn. Flat out. Even as porn, we're not just talking about this in comic terms, we're talking about this in porn terms. It's not good porn, it's not a really good comic, it's just there. There are attempts at humor that are juvenile, even for porn. For example, they introduced 2 new characters, apparently. Not really introduced, because we're still jumped in media res and know nothing about them. But the first thing that happens is they fall into a puddle of dinosaur piss. Funny. It's kind of dumb. If you want to see people having sex in a comic, it's there, but there's probably better comics for that. Okay, moving on. The Normals. This is one of those places that I think The Normals actually presents a really interesting look at first issues, and specifically how you can put together a first issue and how you shouldn't put together a first issue. The first issue really has 2 imperatives. 1, the first issue has to establish what normal is. And 2, the first issue has to break normality. We have to know what this world is like, and then we have to know why what is happening to the characters is interesting and different than what would otherwise just be happening in their lives. In the case of The Normals, it ends up having a lot of major pacing issues because it's trying to do both. Basic premise is a guy is dealing with the fact that he's a family man in a world that is leaving him behind. It's not particularly interesting as a very basic premise, and there's too much, I think, early on of the... What's going on? What do you mean? What do you mean he's fluid? What does that even mean? I thought you said he was gay. This is so strange. Oh, the world confuses me. That being said, though, the character is not unlikable, just he's a little bit too stuck in a particular archetypal mode that I think eventually, thankfully, goes away. And yes, has a purpose to it, but still, that purpose, by the time that purpose comes along, he's broken out of that archetypal mode, so there's really no point in it. Suffice it to say, though, he's talking to his son, who's in a treehouse. Kid falls out of the treehouse, and when he rushes over there to check him out, the kid appears to have a live wire behind his ear. Later on, he finds out that his son appears to be a robot. Well, they decide to go back. He and his wife take their son and daughter back to the town that they grew up in, Liberty, New York, where everybody seems to have forgotten them. And as time goes on, we're supposed to learn more and more, but the problem is that, again, with the pacing on this, so much has to be established that most of it is just told to us. We went to the library and found out that we didn't have any records of us or our families. We did this. This happened. It's just told in narration. The stuff that would normally take a page is told in a single panel in a narration box. And that's not compelling. I don't want to be told what's going on. By the end of the issue, the twist, the thing that breaks the normality of this world, is just told in one big info dump over the course of 2 panels. And again, I understand the difficulty that goes into telling a story like this, because you have to establish what is normal and then break it in 22 pages. That is not easy. And I've got to give the author and the artist, who, hold on, I'm going to look up who they are real quick. Adam Glass and, Dennis Calero. I got to give them credits for trying very, very hard to do that. It's not an easy thing to do, and, kudos to them. But they still didn't really do it well. This whole issue probably should have been a 2 or 3 issue introductory run, and the first run would be predicated on the mystery of it. That would have worked. Instead, they wanted to jump right into everything, and as a result, it's very much they tell us everything, they don't show us it. And in a medium like comics, where the art is so important and showing things is so important, that makes it difficult to work with. All right, so now that we've covered pacing issues, let's talk tone. And with tone, we're going to talk about Pathfinder. What is it called? Rune Scars. Pathfinder Rune Scars, another #1 that came out this week. This is clearly part of a larger Pathfinder set of comics, and it's, as a part of a whole, I guess it's fine, but there's a couple problems. First of all, it's got a #1 on it, and it throws us in with characters who we know nothing about. I still don't know what one of these characters is named, and I read the whole thing. They clearly have had adventures, and things happen to them beforehand that they keep referencing. However, we don't have an opportunity to meet them. Stanley has famously said, every comic is somebody's first comic. When you throw a #1 on a comic, you have to assume that's going to be somebody's first comic, and throwing them into this world with these characters who are already established without taking any time to reestablish them is a failure on the part of the writer, the artist, and the editor. It's not a bad story in and of itself, but here we go with the whole tone thing. Tonally, this thing is all over the place. It doesn't know whether it wants to be silly slapstick humor, or a high fantasy epic, or a detective story in the noir tradition, because it draws from all of those, and none of them mesh. These elements have nothing to tell each other. So, for example, one of the characters is a detective with a badge, like a metal shield style badge. Although he is apparently a private detective, but he's got a badge, and he's different from the Hell Knights, who are the actual law enforcement for this kingdom that they're in. Also, when you call your law enforcement Hell Knights, you can pretty much expect that they're going to be evil. You should not do that. But that aside. So this guy is basically a hard-boiled detective in the noir tradition, and he talks like one. Not, like using the words dame or anything like that, but it's that very brusque, abrupt way of speaking. And there are words they use like sass that really don't fit in a high fantasy setting. unless you're talking rat queens, which rat queens gets to break all the rules by being rat queens. Um, so you have him there. You have at least two of the regular party who speak as if they are in a high fantasy setting. Like they just got home from Galadriel's tea party. You have one character who talks more like a low fantasy Conan-esque pulpy hero. You have one character who just barely skirts the edge of breaking the fourth wall a lot of the time. And then you have one character who is there strictly for slapstick. For example, there's a whole section where he is ineptly attempting to fight a sewer monster and complaining primarily about the smell and not the fact that it has him in its tentacles. Fortunately, the sewer monster sings. The reason why they fell into its trap is because it sings to itself in English, and then one of the characters realized that if it can sing, it can actually talk. So she talks to it and converts it to her religion, which, okay, that sounds interesting, actually. That's a pretty good way of solving that problem. But even the sewer monster, it's not consistently able to speak one way or another. Sometimes it has trouble saying thank you, and sometimes it's pronouncing names of complicated gods like it's nothing. And this is all within 2 pages. This Pathfinder book, RuneScape, does not know what it wants to be. It doesn't know whether it wants to be a humor book. It doesn't know whether it wants to be high fantasy, whether it wants to be a mystery. And the thing is, it could be all of those things, but it has to temper all of those different elements and put them into one cohesive whole that seems to fit together. And this just doesn't. All right. Next up, Ninjak and Shadowman Rapture. All right. I'm going to be honest. I love Valiant Comics. I have since they originally came out, while everyone else was scrambling for Image stuff. I was deep in the Valiant Vault, and I loved it. Particularly Ninjak. He is one of my favorites to this day. I love him. So a Ninjak story is actually pretty cool. Ninjak and Shadowman are probably the two least, even though they're the title characters on, they're probably the least focused on of this entire first run. Mostly Tama, the Geomancer. Tara? I can't remember her name. I'll put it down here. She's the main character, and her stuff was actually pretty cool. She's on the dead side. She is tracking down a cataclysm that's about to happen, and she needs Ninjak and several other people to help her stop it on the dead side. The beginning of this whole thing starts very much like a fairy quest, which I really enjoyed seeing, but it plays with the tropes of it. So, for example, she's trying to get to a demon at the top of this giant hollowed out tree floating in midair. At one point, she comes up to another smaller demon she walks up to him and basically says, okay, you need to ask me a question. I need to answer it because I need to get to the top of the tree and talk to this demon, and I'm in a hurry, so go. So the demon starts telling his riddle, and halfway through, she answers and says bye and walks away. It's great. It is fun. When she finally does get to the demon, it's actually a really touching scene that I enjoyed, and if it weren't for the #1 book this month, or this week, this would probably be my favorite book, just because it was so well written. Having Ninjak in there was a nice change, but you don't really get a lot of his dialogue in it. I like seeing Shadowman / Magpie / Jonathan Boniface, I think his name is. Struggling with his Loa, trying to get under control. All of these characters are familiar characters to me, but if they're not familiar characters to you, they're still well established. If you don't know who any of these people are, this book will give you an idea of what kind of personalities you're expecting, what kind of abilities you're expecting, what kind of threats you can expect. It's what a #1 book genuinely should be. and particularly a #1 book in an established universe. I highly recommend Ninjak Shadowman Rapture. All right. Next, Victor Lavalle's Destroyer. There are things I like about this and things that I don't like about this. So let's start with the things I like. Dr. Baker, Dr. Josephine Baker, who becomes the main character in this, is phenomenal. I really like her as a person. She's just the edge of being too good, but not quite. And the fact that she has the backstory that we're starting to get in this helps a lot. It helps humanize her in a way that other people probably wouldn't be. I also like basically the second half of it. Now, the first half of this is about Frankenstein. 225 years on, Frankenstein's monster is still living in Antarctica, by the way, that's how the book ends. He's living in Antarctica. Which, on one hand, cool, you clearly have read the book. On the other hand, he never says anything, which the monster in the book did speak, so it seems a little weird that he's suddenly mute. I mean, maybe he just doesn't want to speak, but it turns him from the original concept of the Frankenstein monster as a sympathetic monster, a sympathetic creature, to basically a slasher movie villain, to the point that he rips somebody's heart out. And that happens actually in a couple of books this week. And strangely enough, heart ripping is not the oddly incongruous theme. I'm as shocked as you are. But yeah, so the first half just kind of has Frankenstein's monster tearing its way through whale fishermen, which, okay, whalers want to, I don't know, I'd prefer this happen. But that's just me. It didn't work for me. The second half was interesting, but I'm not sure if I'm going to pursue it, just because I'm afraid that I'm going to have to deal with that first half stuff again, and half a comic just is not worth my money or my time. The art's okay. It's not beautiful, but it's pretty good. I mean, it's worth taking a look at. And you might enjoy it, but I didn't see anything spectacular in this. Okay, Zone Lords. How do I describe this? Did you see that recent Diamante Hagen about the Italian exploitation film that Teddy actually reviewed? I'll put the link in the bottom, but it's post-apocalyptic 80s new wave metal something. I'm not even sure what it is. What I will say is that in trying to figure out who published this, I ran into what I've got to say is the coolest, most fun marketing video I have seen for a comic possibly ever, and I'll give you just 30 seconds of it right here.
Zone Lords has it all. Dramatic encounters, hot rods, heroic deeds, ritualistic sacrifices, cool dudes rip-roaring action, and more.
I know! You kind of want... I want to see cool dudes. I want to see ritual sacrifice. And you know what? The book does not disappoint on that. It's a black and white, but the art is distinct enough that I don't feel like anything is falling into the background or that I'm losing anything. It doesn't feel sloppy in any way. It feels precise. It's silly. It is incredibly silly. It is ridiculous on a number of levels. But you know what? sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. Basically, and I don't understand the premise either, but I don't think I'm supposed to understand the full premise of it. I mean, I understand parts of the premise. I just don't understand how it came along. So basically, it seems that there's a prison, and for corporal punishments, for people who, I guess, are so evil that they would normally die, instead, they're possessed by demons forever. Which seems counterproductive to me. But that's a thing! Like, hey, you're evil, let's put another evil thing inside your body. That'll teach you. What? Okay, but that's the premise. That's part of the premise. Two guys are essentially too fast, too furiousing to New York in order to get through a particular zone because some other guy that one of them owes money to was about to take over a zone, and zones are a thing. I'm not exactly sure what they mean, but this is kind of like the original Old Man Logan comic without any of the Marvel stuff. In the sense that it is a buddy road trip movie with Western influences going through the blighted landscape of what used to be the United States and is now broken up into arbitrary zones. But you know what? There's a soundtrack that goes with it from a apparently reasonably well-known electronica band. If that's a thing. Is that a thing? That could be a thing. I don't know. Zone Lodge was fun. If you want ridiculous fun, you're not going to be disappointed with this. Are you going to understand everything? No, but a story doesn't have to explain everything at first. In fact, it's better if it doesn't and you learn things as you go. So, you know, with that in mind, this actually fits as a pretty good number one. Alright, so, oh wow, we are down to our final book, which would be the top book of the week, my favorite, and that's Samaritan Veritas. This is actually a follow-up to another series of books that I liked, which was The Tithe, and is apparently part of the Edenverse, they call it, with a lot of these same characters working around some of the same plots. It's a fun little, not fun, it's an interesting world of hackers and televangelists and Robin Hooding. It's, you know, it's got a lot of intrigue to it. If you're into intrigue, then this is the book for you. One thing I particularly like about it is that the writer does his best to throw in a lot of actual research to what he's doing, so everything rings true. It feels like what he's talking about is a thing that is real, because a lot of the times it is, and that he's actually done some research on this. More to the point, at the end of it, I like that the author has stuff to say. He talks to the audience, kind of talks about where he's going with this, what he's thinking, what his inspirations were. I like seeing that insight because it makes me appreciate what I just read more. You know, there's only so much I can consume media-wise. There's only so many things I can read, so many things I can watch, so many things I can listen to. So when somebody tells me, hey, here's this thing that I was inspired by, and it helped me create this, what that says to me is, there's this thing that I might be interested in. And it, you know, and the author also publishes links to everything on his website, which I think is kind of cool. And it says in the back where you can find it, so that you can just click and, you know, do your research and see what's going on. The characters in this are fantastic. The title character, Samaritan, is her hacker name. Her name is Sam. Is essentially trying to take down a ultra-conservative religious president who faked a bunch of terrorist bombings in the United States in order to get elected. She's actually determined to kill him, and she figures the best way to do that is in prison. So she has a friend in the FBI who has essentially been tasked with taking her down, She's a very smart character and one that I like seeing coming up and over again. I like, and the author who, hold on, let me get his name because I really like his writing. I can never remember his name for the life of me. Matt Hawkins. He does some great work. I gotta say, his characters are likable and have depth to them. That's not something that you often see. Art-wise, Atilio Rojo is the artist on this, and I adore his artwork. It has the sense of stained glass to it, in that everything stands out. Every panel seems to tell a story in and of itself. It's very sparse artwork. Not in the sense that everything isn't filled in the panel. In fact, quite the opposite. The panel's actually really well used entirely. But every panel is there to tell a story. It's very streamlined, I guess would be the best way to put it. Honestly, there's not much more I can say about this except that Samaritan Veritas, if it is anything like The Tithe, or Postal's another one that's in that, or what was the other one? Think Tank. These are all part of the Edenverse. Anything like those, it's going to be great. This first issue seems to really indicate that it will be. Okay, so there we go for the week. Now, let's talk about the oddly incongruous themes. Or theme in this case. This week's oddly incongruous theme is Judeo-Christian mythology. And I'm not just saying, like, in terms of actual myth or anything. I'm saying, like, even the characters are drawing from it. It keeps coming up over and over again, and sometimes excellently, sometimes not so much. But it is in kind of all of this week's books, even the porn one. I'm not kidding. No, you don't have to read. Just trust me on this one. You don't actually have to read it to know that. Just trust me. All right. So, I think we're good. I'm glad to be back, and I will be seeing you all next week. Take care. I know what you're thinking. How can I help Karu travel to Japan so that he can be bitten by one of the radioactive boars there and become Boar Man? Well, fear not. You can make that dream come true by donating only $1 or $2 to our Patreon, which will also make you eligible for fabulous prizes. If you can't contribute financially, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and especially sharing with your friends. It costs you nothing and goes a long way toward helping the channel grow, reaching new people who, like you, think that comics are literature. Thank you.